Hi, this is Dan from We Fashion Wood. Today I'll be showing you how I made what I lovingly call the safety table. So I'm not the typical YouTube woodworker. I don't have a bunch of fancy tools. I don't have a big shop. But what I do have is a desire to learn and make cool stuff. Before the pandemic hit, I would pretty much take on any home renovation work that my wife would let me. I never considered myself a finished woodworker, and still kind of have a little bit of trouble saying that I am one today. I still have so much to learn, and this is my journey, so I hope you join me and learn something yourself. The wood we're working with is walnut. I got it from a guy named John. I found him on a Facebook Marketplace. Now, Facebook Marketplace isn't usually the most ideal place to get wood from. You never know what you're going to get. It's usually a mixed bag of things. But this wasn't my first go around with John. This is the second time I got walnut from him, and the first batch that I got from him was probably some of the best walnut that I had. And the reason I know that is because there's zero case hardening when I cut it. And having had a whole lot of experience with case hardening, I can tell you I know it when I see it, and this was probably the best wood I've ever used. And I've even bought some of the really expensive stuff from the really expensive sellers. He used a solar kiln, which may be the reason that it was such good wood, but it does take about 3 times as long to do in a solar kiln than a regular kiln. So I'm just going to start out the premise for this channel by saying you could tell that I will not edit out the imperfections because the first thing I show is a screw up here. We were using the pull saw for a rough cut and then realized it's a rough cut, so switched over to the Sawzall and then made a terrible cut. And if you make a bad cut once, might as well do it again just to reiterate that you cannot cut straight with a Sawzall. You may have noticed my cheap Wen track saw. Again, I'm sure that the Festool does way better, but I am a garage shop. I do this for a hobby. I don't have enough money to buy a Festool. Well, maybe I do, but I can think of 20 other things I need to buy before I buy that. This track saw works great, so why replace it now? For under $100 and all the cuts that I've made with it, it is well worth the price I paid for it. As a matter of fact, I assumed I'd have to replace the blade pretty early on, but I'm on table 35, 36, and I still haven't had to replace the blade yet. However, it will only cut 2 3/4 inches deep, so I do have to finish it off with a pull saw or other saw a lot of the time. And here's the finished layout that we ended up with. And then it was on to a little bit of cleanup sanding for the edges. We probably could have got this a little bit better with the wire wheel, but doing the sander is kind of normal practice for me now. The Restore tool is on my wish list, which is a tool that allows you to debark inside your shop because it has a vacuum attachment, but it's not a necessity right now because we do all of our bark removal outside. Short of flattening, there's nothing really you can do in your shop that's more messy than removing bark. And now that I see myself working with a cut saw, I take that back. Cut saw carving is the most messy thing you can do. See, I'm always proving myself wrong. And in the end, I really didn't even need to cut that out because it got cut off the final length of the table. This is the all-important vacuuming. I feel like I'm doing this all the time. Now, here is something I came up with all on my own. Now, it doesn't mean I didn't steal parts of the ideas from different people, but putting the whole process together is completely mine. So my table there is natural polyethylene, and those strips are made of UHMW polyethylene, which is for ultra-high molecular weight polyethylene. And what I do is I hot glue them onto the areas where there are gaps. So this is just structural. I'm not trying to cover every single little micro hole that might be there. I'm really just trying to get these pieces into place. And here you can really see my awesome craftsmanship from my rough cut. And believe it or not, I do get a little bit better with the Japanese pull saw every time I use it. Wow, I should be really ashamed of myself for that gap. I'm not, but I probably should be. And this is where the sealing gets done. So we put a huge bead of silicone caulk all around the table. There is no aesthetics involved here. This is all about getting complete total protection. Epoxy flows like water, and if there's any little tiny gap, it's going to find its way out. Each silicone tube costs about $4.50, so on this table I spent about $9 in silicone. I did get one little tiny pinhole leak on this table, but it wasn't even worth showing because I found it really quick and patched it quick. And as I rewatched the video, I could see exactly where it happened because there was a small gap in the silicone. So after the silicone's all on, just smooth it all out with a finger, one pass. So prior to doing this table, I did a little experiment trying to get some of my techniques down with a smaller table that I ended up giving away. And when I was doing that, what I really wanted to do was get some of the black to leach into the sapwood. Now, usually you're trying to avoid this from happening. And when it does happen, sometimes you throw the table out because you don't want black leaching into your wood. I liked the way that it looked in a certain way, and I thought with orange mix it would actually look pretty good. So I'm going to mix up some epoxy here, and then I'm going to put a lot of black in it and paint it onto the sapwood to see if I can get some to leach into it. This is the liquid glass deep pour epoxy. And it's really important to scrape the sides and the bottom while you're mixing. Typically, I started off doing 5 minutes of mixing because that's what the instructions said. Now I mix it for a little over 3, but I can just tell when it's mixed up. There's little lines that disappear. It's really hard to explain. But I'm going to try. This is going to be a really nerdy explanation, though. So the different parts of the epoxies have different refraction. The different refraction between the two can be seen as little lines in the epoxy. When those little lines disappear, then you know the epoxy is mixed all the way. So this is actually my favorite way to seal wood too, using deep pour epoxy. So what I'll do is I'll paint it on, wait 2 days, and then do my deep pour. And 2 days isn't long enough for the epoxy to fully cure, but it is enough to seal the wood. So you'll end up with a chemical bond between your deep pour painted on and your deep pour poured. So you'll get a good bond there as opposed to a mechanical bond. If you let the epoxy harden that you've painted on, then you have to go back and sand it, and the only way that that epoxy is gripping is through where you sanded it. Because if it's smooth epoxy, fresh epoxy isn't going to bond to it really at all, so you have to sand it off. The chemical bond is a little bit stronger, or a lot of bit stronger, so I highly recommend that if you're going to seal with a deep pour and to not let it cure all the way. Here I'm just rubbing my drips off because I did use some of the dye, and the dye will leach into the wood, so I wipe as much of it off as I can. I liked how it was going, so I decided to go ahead and mix up some more black. If you keep watching, what you'll find out is I don't really care about the bottom of my tables whatsoever. And the reason this is because Grandma's table was always rough on the bottom, and nobody ever said anything about it. So here I'm pouring more in, and this will do 2 things. This small pour will seal up anything that I may have missed with my silicone. Then the other thing that it will do is it will fill in any voids that are at the bottom of the table. And really, I don't care if there's some epoxy exposed. I'm not going to flatten all the way down to that. Most of my clients, when asked, will say they want to keep the thickness and don't care how the bottom looks. So I don't really go all out on the bottom. Now, if this was a $10,000 table belt, which it isn't, I definitely would flatten everything all the way down to the wood and make it look perfect, but it isn't. You know, if I spend 65 hours on a table, then yes, it'd be a $10,000 table and I would finish the bottom to perfection, but that's not what I'm doing. I'm making the top look perfect. The bottom stays rough, stays ugly, and I don't really care, and neither do my customers. Now this step for the most part is completely unnecessary, but it is good to know that it can be done. You can pop bubbles with a heat gun, or you can use a torch. I'm not cool. I always say this, I'm not cool, so I don't use a torch. The truth of the matter is you need less good control when you use a torch, and I don't have a ton of fine motor control, so the heat gun works way better for me, so I don't risk burning anything. The other part of this is that it's really cool to do in person, so it's one of those satisfying things that you do, so maybe unnecessary, but definitely fun to do. So here, after 18 hours, the epoxy's had time to thicken up, so I repainted it. Oh yeah, I gotta stop and pick some off. That's so satisfying. I really just wanted the live edge on the inside to be black, and that's the only reason I did it. Before I forget, you can use the denatured alcohol to pop the bubbles too. I like doing that from time to time. It all depends on the application. So now it's on to mixing up our deep pour epoxy and use this stick to keep it from falling in. Get the last little bit of the A out. This is a 2-to-1 mix. So 2 parts A to 1 part B. I have a little gauge on the side of the bucket there so I can see how much is going into the bucket. Not a gauge. That would be a level line. Yeah, there's little measuring lines. There's measuring lines on the side of the bucket to tell where I'm at with the deep pour. It does play a funny refractive trick on your eye, so you really have to look at the side of these HDX buckets if you're going to use those. So keep your mixer well below the surface, and you will not introduce bubbles and make it cloudy like I did here, so you can see that it's cloudy. So the pigment I went with ended up being a 3-to-1 mix. 3 of the pumpkin from Perlex and 1 of the, I want to say, traffic cone from Black Diamond. I know that's not the right color, but I don't have it sitting right in front of me here, so I don't remember, but it looks like a traffic cone. So at this point in the project, I had to clamp the slabs down, and that's more or less because as I pour the epoxy in, the table will actually float. The wood floats in the epoxy, so you have to clamp it down. I didn't do the corners because the UHMW strips that are there are glued to the table, and they're glued to the wood, so they'll keep the corners down. If it's little pieces, the glue will work fine, but if it gets bigger, you have to clamp it down or it will try to float. So now you can really see the contrast between the black on the live edge and the orange epoxy. So you may ask at this point, how do I know how much epoxy to use? The truth is, I don't. I have way too much of it here, and I just mix it up 1.5 gallons at a time because that's as much as I can degas at one time. But if you are wondering how to do it, all you have to do is take a measurement across the river every 6 inches, add all those numbers together, and divide it by the amount of measurements that you took, and that'll give you an average. Then you multiply that times the length of your river, and then times the height of your river. And then you take 1/8 inch times the total size of your table for the shrinkage and for what's going to spill under the boards. I get asked this one so much that I think at some point I'm just going to go ahead and make a little Excel calculator for everyone. So let me know in the comments what you think of this orange. I love orange. It's my favorite color, but I don't necessarily like it for tables only because brown is basically a dark orange. And I feel like in a table, it has a chance to clash. And this is actually why I wanted some of the black to leach into the sapwood and why I put the black up onto the sides of the live edge. So doing a little bit more unnecessary bubble popping here. And I say it's unnecessary because the open time of the epoxy is so long that all these bubbles have plenty of time to pop on their own. They don't really need the assistance. But again, it is cool to watch and to do. And for our final coat of epoxy, we're going with clear. And for clear, you have to degas because the micro bubbles do not get hidden by the pigment at all. You will see them. It will make the epoxy look cloudy. So when you first turn on the vacuum for your vacuum chamber, the bubbles are going to rise within like 1 or 2 minutes, and you're going to have to turn the pump off to make sure that it doesn't go up to the top too quickly. And then you typically end up waiting between 15 and 30 minutes for it to start going down. Once it starts going down, you can keep flipping the vacuum on. It's kind of cool, and I end up standing there watching it a whole lot, so I do it a lot. And then after that's done, this one actually has a little filter on the muffler, more or less, on the inlet, so it doesn't let the air in too quickly, but a lot of them don't. So you have to be careful opening that valve up, because if it goes in too quick, it could shoot epoxy all over the place. So pouring it onto the table here, you could see that the orange is sanded at this point. I lost some video doing this, but I did have to sand that. There was no real way out of it. I was going to have to sand the edges because, pour the edges, wait 2 days, pour the orange. By the time the orange was tacky, I would have to sand the edges, so I waited 1 more day and sanded the whole thing. I did say a chemical bond is better, and yes, it is. But in this particular instance, there's no real way to avoid it, because you're going to have to sand the edges, and you can't really do that if you have a tacky center. So it is a mechanical bond here, but only for a thin layer of clear that goes across the top. So after a couple of days, it gets nice and hard, and I can't help but tap on it, rub my finger over it, touch it. It just looks really cool when it comes out. You can see a couple micro bubbles there up on the edges, but in the finished product, it will all kind of blend in. You do your best to avoid them, but every once in a while you get them, and you're making a decision at that point. Do I want to drill them out and re-pour them, or are they okay? And at this point, some of these are okay. The idea here is balancing reality with hope, and the hope is that you'll always end up with perfect, but on a 3-pour table to not get any bubbles would be unrealistic. And this may also be why most of the tables that you see are 2-pour tables, because with a 2-pour, I can pretty much keep out all the bubbles. And you can see just how easy this mold is to separate. I actually pulled it off by hand. I proved to some of the people online that it could be done by hand, that we don't really need mold release on these. They're self-lubricating. Which taught me a very valuable lesson. Do not ever try to prove something to your haters, because they're just going to find something else wrong with it. All you really need to do is egg them on so they drive up your watch time and your engagement. But it actually was pretty cool to do. I've never done it this way before on a big table. I always thought I could, where I just push the table down and peel it up. And I was 99% sure it worked, but actually doing it I thought was pretty neat. And I'm probably going to demold this way from now on too. So there you go. You got to love your haters. I learned something new from having haters. Dropping the table is completely unnecessary, but it looks good on video, so I always do it. And I know here you're probably saying, Dan, you told us you were this little garage shop, and here you have a CNC machine flattening your table. Well, it's not what you think it is. This is a hobby CNC. All in, it cost me $2,000, and as you can see, I didn't dog it down properly the first time because I thought the weight would. I was wrong. But most of you should be able to find a cabinet shop that would help you be able to flatten this. I can't find any near me, so I was kind of stuck. I was doing it with a hand router, and it just made a huge mess. So I decided I was going to get a little CNC machine, or, try to get someone else to do it. And after failing at getting someone else to help me do the flattening, I decided, okay, I'll spend $2,000 on a CNC. It's been worth every penny, but I've done probably 36, 37 tables, and we're already at a point where I'm looking at getting something bigger. So I may end up with a big industrial CNC machine, not quite yet. And then maybe I can't say I'm a garage shop anymore. Then I have to say, I got some professional equipment because I got a couple of people who wanted to buy my tables. But for right now, really, flattening is the biggest pain in the butt. You have to figure out some way to do it. And whether you do it by hand or whether you take it into somebody, there's a couple of different options. This is the way that I found to solve it, and it cost me $2,000. If you want to know more about it, I could tell you all about it. Just reach out to me. Now that I'm done, feeling guilty about saying I'm a garage shop and I do things on the cheap. I definitely still do things on the cheap, but like I do realize that this is a luxury item, and I know that not everybody has this, but I promise you, most of you can find a cabinet shop that will flatten your tables for you for a fee. After all of that, just realize I do know that it's a luxury item, but trust that you can probably find a cabinet maker that's willing to do this for a price in your local area. But if you do decide on getting your own CNC, I will warn you of this. It is absolutely mesmerizing for me. I can't get anything else done when the CNC is running and doing flattening. I know exactly what to expect. I know it's going to run in its little circle. I know it's going to make its little cuts, but every single time I end up getting mesmerized by it. I stand there and stare at it, like get nothing else done, so just be forewarned. So all I did with the bottom is hit it with Cubitron sandpaper. I really only end up sanding it to 150, and then as soon as I can, I start making my final cut to size dimension cuts. Pretty much universally, my customers will tell me they would prefer that the table be thick than it be smooth. So I always give them the option. They always pick the same thing. So here I'm making the cuts with my little cheap Wen track saw. It would take the same with the smaller Festool too. The track saw motors are notoriously underpowered, but really they do make the smoothest cuts. I think they're more designed for MDF than small sheets of particle board and plywood and stuff like that than they are designed to cut through a thick table. But they do cut down. You just have to make a couple of passes at it. So this first cut here is my reference cut, and you can see my safety flip-flops there. And all the other cuts are based upon it. So I do the first cut, and then I measure the top of the track to the other end to get them perfect. And then I measured it right before I shipped it out here and checked it for square, and it was literally within a 30-second on each side. If you watch me on my other platform, you already know that I measure 35 times and cut once. And that is exactly what I did for my C-channels here. Now, locking the roller on my bench, that's a whole nother story. I always forget to do it, so I'm always pushing back against it. So you'll see a lot of the table rocking around, and that's because I am bad at locking my wheels. If you were paying close attention, you'll notice that I just made my second screw up on this table. There was a little divot there when I was using the plunge cutter. The C-channel will cover it up, so I'm not too worried about it here, but here maybe I redeem myself for the CNC as I have the world's cheapest plunge router. And I actually have a friend who has a nicer one, and I prefer this one because it seems to be made for people with giant hands, and I have giant hands, and it just fits my hands perfect. And if you've never seen a fat guy do a 185-pound flip, now you have. So this brings me to my favorite part of the build, sanding. I know most people totally hate sanding and complain about it, but not me. I actually love it. It's the one time I can completely, totally shut my brain off. So compared to a lot of the rotted wood that I choose to work with, this table had like nothing wrong with it. There's a couple little pits, and you can see they're super tiny. That pick is tiny as it is, and you can see that the grain sections are bigger than some of the scratches. Some of those holes are just slightly bigger than the grain. And this is probably the most open grain walnut I've ever had. So there is these little grain patterns all over the place on it. I really did like it. So here I'm just filling it in with some black CA glue, and I'm using the nozzle applicator on it. Sometimes I use a pick, and I think I show that, or the brushes in this video, one of the two. But sometimes I use the end of my pick, sometimes I use a brush. It all depends on what the situation calls for. After the CA glue, give it a little spritz with the accelerator, and if it goes down again, fill it back up, and then hit it with the accelerator again. And as you can see here, the accelerator causes crystallization and cracks, so just be wary of that. Know that it happens, and you may have to hit a spot a couple times before it's perfect. Ah yes, and here is the paintbrush. I buy these little disposable paintbrushes. I don't use them all the time. I think I prefer the pick most of the time, but it just seemed to be the right tool for the application this time. This is a great shot here to show just how open that grain is. If you're not looking at me filling in the pits there, just look at the grain of the wood there. I'm pretty sure I cut the video out, but I did have to turn it up on the side to fill that knot hole on the side there. So if you're wondering if I just left it, no, I didn't. I turned the table up on the side and do basically the exact same thing on the side of the table. This hole looks a little bit bigger than what it was, and you'll be able to see here in a second when I rub my finger over it. You really don't want to fill up anything too big with the CA glue. That's about the limit of the size I would go. If it was any bigger than that, I would probably say you want to fill it back up with epoxy. Another great day to work on the safety table. I've already sanded it down to 320 here, and now I start putting some tape on, and I get a couple minutes into it, and I knock the camera over, so lost all that video. There wasn't really any video. It's more video of the ground. So when you see me cut out, it's because I just knocked the camera over with the air hose and didn't even realize I did it until I was done taping. So jumping right to the 1000+ cutting compound. And this is the majority of where the shine comes from. And I only use a little 3-inch pad here. And this was my first time using the 3-inch. Usually I use a 5 or a 6-inch. But I highly recommend the 3-inch because it did not tear any of my tape up. I was very excited about that. Normally, my tape gets torn out and I end up scraping cutting compound out of the wood grain, and this was much better. Very clean. I just realized I did not show this part, but I have already wet sanded the epoxy all the way up to 2000, from 600 to 1000, then to 1500, then to 2000. Now I'm about to say something very controversial. It is almost impossible to do this without having any scratches in it. So if you attempt this, don't try. Just aim to get a little bit better each time. I just watched this, Cam from Blacktail Studios. He did the exact same thing that I did. He called a bunch of car guys up, watched a bunch of car guy videos, and tried to get it perfect. He got to the point on his video where he just had to quit because he couldn't get his clear coat perfect. Cam's a super detailed guy, and if he can't get it perfect, chances are that you in your garage are not going to be able to get it perfect. I've gotten it perfect twice, and on both very small tables. This one, I'm sure if you get the right angle on it, you'll be able to see where there is a couple of scuff marks in it, or swirls, or little tiny scratches, or little pieces of hair, or something. I go through it, and I know where each one of those are, but I will tell you what, nobody but me sees those. I hate them, and I dream and scheme of ways to make sure that they'll go away and never come back, but at the end of the day, you cannot expect yourself to be completely without any flaws ever, especially when doing these top clear coats. You can have the world's greatest sander, the world's greatest buffer, be working in a clean room, and one of your eyelashes is going to fall out and get in there and make a little swirl somewhere. And if you're like me, you'll start over. You'll go all the way back to 320 grit, re-sand everything, try again, only to have the eyelash fall off the other eye the next time. On a surface like this, in a dusty environment, it is not impossible, but it is improbable. And with that, I await all the car guys telling me that I just don't know what I'm doing. But like I said, this is a journey. I enjoy learning. If you have something to share, I am definitely willing to listen, especially on this topic, because I have asked everybody. So if you know something better than I do, I am totally willing to hear it. So this is the last little cleanup. I think I'm either using mineral spirits or denatured alcohol. I think at this point I'm totally just using denatured alcohol, but I've used mineral spirits here too. I've never had a problem with it with my finish going on afterward, but I have heard horror stories, so I did buy into the hype a little bit and bought some denatured alcohol. So I've gotten to a point now that there are only two finishes in the world. There is Rubio Monocoat and everything else. Like pretty much every other dedicated Rubio user, we started with Osmo. I started with Osmo, loved Osmo, and then realized I could get a more satin finish with a better feel to the wood with the Rubio. And then I also noticed with the furniture in my own house that it offered quite a bit better protection. And once I switched, there was no going back because I just really love this stuff. I even love the way that it smells. And you may notice there is a gentleman on this video because this video was taken off of my other platform doing a live event, and it's the only video evidence I have of doing this because I lost the video off my camera. This seemed to be a reoccurring event for this. When I was making films for my other platform, I never lost video, like maybe 2 videos, but this table, I kept losing video for it over and over again. But that's what it should look like. Nice thick layer on there. You can't put too much on, but you can definitely not take enough off. So after you get that layer on there, you got to hit it with a rag. And in my case, it's always 4 rags. I take 2 to get the bulk of it off, and then I go back over it again and go with it clean. And if they come back and they're a little yellow, I'll do 2 more rags on it too. So wipe it all off, wipe it very good. Can't wipe too much off. Oh, and before I forget, that man in the right side who keeps freezing is Josh from JMB Woodworks. He does some really cool stuff. You should check him out. He did me a huge favor during the event and narrated because I could not look at the screen, so he was answering questions for me while I was doing the live event. And here is our finished product. So if you made it this far, all I can do is ask that you like, share, and subscribe. This is my first YouTube video, so I'm very excited to see what happens with it. I'm pretty successful on my other platform, but this is dipping the toe in the water to see if there is an audience there, and this is the only way you can really tell me if I should be making more videos. Thanks so much for watching.